There is a moment in this story that does not make the front page. No arrest record attached to it, no photograph, no 911 call, no courtroom count in the indictment. Just two men, somewhere in Chicago, two men who know each other well enough that neither of them flinches at certain conversations. And then one of them hears that somebody is dead. The dead person was an informant, a snitch, in the language of the street they both came from. The other man laughs. Not a slip, not a reflex. According to the man sitting next to him, a man who would later repeat this exact moment to a federal grand jury, the laughter was clear, deliberate, not shock, recognition. The man who laughed was Paris Poe. The man who watched him laugh was Keith Daniels. 10 days later, Paris Poe killed Keith Daniels. And when Daniels' grand jury testimony was read aloud in a federal courtroom 3 years after his death, when a dead man's words travel back across time to describe a living man's laughter, Paris Poe sat at the defense table and did not move, not with a murder, not with an arrest, with a laugh in a room that nobody was supposed to remember. Somebody remembered. Most Chicago street gangs have a structure you can map: a name, a block, a color, a set of rules that trace back to some founding moment in a specific neighborhood. Organizations built over decades with hierarchies that function, for better or catastrophically worse, like institutions. The Hobos were something different. Federal prosecutors described them as a conglomerate. Others used the word renegade. The description I keep coming back to, because I think it is the most honest, called them an all-star team of the worst of the worst. They were not built from scratch in one neighborhood. They were assembled selectively and deliberately from the most dangerous members of the gangster disciples and the black disciples on Chicago's South Side. Their roots trace back to the Robert Taylor homes, a public housing complex on the South Side that the city demolished in the mid-2000s, long after what it had produced was already out in the world. Think about what it takes to get flagged as too dangerous inside a Chicago street gang. Now imagine somebody went out and recruited those people on purpose. That is the Hobos. Gregory Bowlegs Chester ran the organization. Under Chester, at roughly equal rank, no formal titles, no org chart, sat Arnold Council, Paris Poe, and Gabriel Bush. What held the structure together was not paperwork. It was a shared understanding of what happened when you broke the code. The code came in two slogans. The first, "The earth is our turf." No corner of Chicago was off limits. No target was too far, too protected, too dangerous. The territory was everywhere, which functionally meant the rules applied everywhere too. The second slogan is the one I think people underestimate: hobo or nothing. Not hobo above family, not hobo above blood, above loyalty, above your own history. Nothing. The alternative to hobo is nothing. You are either fully inside this world or you do not exist. There is no middle ground, no partial membership, no exit ramp. You chose this, and this chose you back, and those two things are now the same permanent thing. Federal prosecutors were specific in their filings, in their press releases, in their opening arguments about what made the Hobos distinct. Not drug volume, not the number of members, not how many blocks they controlled. What the Hobos were known for, above everything else, was their brutal executions of people who cooperated with law enforcement. That was the product. That was the enforcement mechanism. That was what the name meant on the street. And what the Hobos repeatedly did across nearly a decade was make sure that silence was the only rational option available to anyone who knew anything. When the trial finally began in September of 2016, the courtroom itself became a document of everything they had built. The judge ordered jurors' names kept secret, anonymous jury, a designation reserved in the American legal system for organized crime cases and terrorism trials. United States Marshals filed a request to have all 6 defendants shackled throughout the proceedings because of reported threats already circulating against witnesses. The Hobos were in handcuffs at the defense table, and the room was still afraid of them. That is the world Paris Poe did not stumble into. That is the world he helped construct block by block, body by body, over the better part of a decade. The laugh made perfect sense. Paris Poe had a lot of names. Poleroski, Poleroski. Those were the ones people on the street used. Elongated, specific, the kind of name that gets invented organically when someone has been around long enough to become a fixture of a place. He also went by Chief Hobo, which was not a formal rank. It was a declaration of function. He was not the leader of the Hobos. Gregory Chester was the leader. Paris Poe's role in the organization was something else entirely. He was the man you called when something needed to be finished. You could read his resume through his body, full back tattoo, "The earth is our turf," Hobo. On his arm, in slightly uneven lettering, Chief Hobo, spelled Cheif, a misspelling preserved permanently in skin. I am not going to make a joke about that. The man had 3 life sentences coming. He could spell it however he wanted. The first time Paris Poe killed for the Hobos on the public record was January the 19th, 2006. The victim's name was Wilbert Moore. Moore was a drug dealer who operated in and around the Ida B. Wells housing projects on Chicago's South Side. He had a life that existed in the margins, the way a lot of lives in that era did in 2006. Real, present, navigating the pressures of a neighborhood that offered very few clean choices. He had also been a Chicago police informant since 2004. Those two things, dealer and cooperator, coexisted for a while. That arrangement ended when Moore provided information that led authorities directly to Arnold Council's home. The search turned up narcotics, multiple kinds, and firearms. Council found out Moore was the source. In the language of every street organization in that city, Moore was a snitch. And in the Hobos, in an organization whose defining characteristic was the permanent elimination of people who cooperated with law enforcement, that was not a label you survived. Gabriel Bush spotted Moore's car parked outside a barbershop. He made a call. Poe and Council arrived together. Council drove. Poe sat in the back seat. When Moore came out, Poe opened fire from inside the vehicle. Moore ran. He made it to an empty lot nearby before he fell. Poe got out of the car, walked to where Moore was on the ground, and shot him again at close range. When police arrived, they found Moore in the empty lot. The shooting, the medical examiner would confirm, had been thorough. Paris Poe did not leave anything unresolved. Afterward, he bragged about it. To fellow inmates Brian Zentmeyer and Marcus Morgan, Poe described the murder with something witnesses characterized not as relief, but as pride. He brought it up, he elaborated, he wanted people to know, because what you have in January of 2006 is not a man who killed once under extreme pressure and buried it. What you have is a man who killed, felt confirmed by the act, and said so out loud to other people. The pattern was now established, even if nobody outside the organization had named it yet. Informant is identified. Word reaches the inner circle. Poe is called. The informant stops being a problem. It worked with Wilbert Moore in 2006. It would be used again in 2013. The difference the second time was who the target was. Not a dealer from the projects, not someone on the periphery of the organization who had served his purpose and become a liability. The informant the second time was someone Arnold Council had personally recruited into the Hobos. His younger brother, Keith Daniels, was not a stranger to the Hobos. He was not an outsider who drifted too close, not someone who got caught in the wrong place or inherited trouble through geography alone. Keith Daniels was inside the organization because Arnold Council, his older brother, put him there. The prosecution's opening statement said it plainly. One of those persons that he recruited in was his younger brother, Keith Daniels. The Hobos were not just an organization that killed informants. They were an organization where the man who recruited his own younger brother would later sit at the same defense table as the man who shot that brother dead in front of his children. Arnold Council did not just lose a brother to the code, he had helped place that brother inside the code. And when the code came for Keith, Arnold did not break from it. The question the record cannot fully answer is why Keith Daniels flipped. The public record does not give us a clean answer. No single moment on file, no courtroom scene where Daniels explains himself in his own words. What the record gives us is a timeline. June the 1st, 2011. Daniels put on a wire and purchased 50 grams of heroin from Gregory Chester, with federal agents listening in real time. That was the first controlled buy. There were two more after it, additional purchases from Chester and from a man named Lance Dillard, each one recorded, each one building a federal case against the leadership of the same organization his brother had brought him into. Daniels knew what he was doing. He also knew, better than almost anyone, exactly what the Hobos did to people who did it. The threat started in 2012. April, someone sent a Facebook message to his girlfriend. The message said Keith was working for the police. August the 16th, a brick came through a window of their home with a handwritten note attached. The note said he had a lot of nerve still living on the South Side that everybody already knew. February of 2013. A Hobos member came to Daniels' home and pointed a gun directly at his face. After that, the FBI moved the entire family. Daniels, his girlfriend, Shanice Petrie, their two young children, out of Chicago, south to Dolton, a suburb 20 miles from the city. 20 miles is a commute in any other context. Inside this story, 20 miles was supposed to be the distance between a man and everyone who wanted him dead. It was not enough. April the 4th, 2013, Keith Daniels appeared before a federal grand jury. He described Chester's operation. He described the hierarchy. He described the inner mechanics of an organization that had spent years perfecting the art of making witnesses disappear from the inside with the authority of someone who had watched it operate up close. And in that grand jury room, Daniels described something else, something specific, something that had apparently stayed with him. He told the jury about a moment he had witnessed firsthand. He and Paris Poe were together when they received news that another informant, someone else who had been cooperating with law enforcement, had been killed. Daniels told the grand jury what Poe did when he heard. He laughed, not a pause, not a look that passed between them. Laughter. Federal prosecutors, in their subsequent filings, noted it directly. The fact that Poe was pleased and amused by the murder of an informant is clearly relevant to his opinion about persons who cooperate with law enforcement. Pleased and amused. That is the official language of a federal court filing. Keith Daniels walked into a federal grand jury room and told the truth about Paris Poe. He gave the government what it needed. He named the hierarchy, described the violence, and handed prosecutors a case they had been building for 2 years. 6 days later, on April the 10th, Gregory Chester was arrested. Daniels had done the thing. He had walked into the center of a world that had been trying to kill him for 2 years, testified under oath, and delivered. He had 4 days left. Sunday, April the 14th, 2013. The kind of Sunday that passes without leaving a mark on anyone. A family dinner at a grandparent's house. The particular rhythm of a meal that ends with chairs scraping back from the table, coats being found, children being gathered from wherever they have wandered. The ordinary machinery of an evening winding down. Keith Daniels was 27 years old. His girlfriend, Shanice Petrie, was driving. In the back seat, her two young children, Daniel's stepchildren, a girl, 4 years old, a boy, 6. They were playing with toys. They were heading back to the apartment in Dolton, the apartment the FBI had helped them find, the address that was supposed to put distance between them and the people looking for him. Across town, sometime before that car made it back, Paris Poe reached down and cut his electronic monitoring bracelet from his ankle. He was on supervised release. The bracelet was the legal condition of his freedom. Cutting it was a federal offense on top of whatever came next. He cut it anyway. The thing he was about to do was so catastrophically worse than a bracelet violation that the bracelet violation did not factor into the math at all. There is a version of this night where something interrupts the plan. The car arrives earlier than expected. A neighbor notices a figure standing too still near the bushes. A patrol car passes at the wrong moment and sends everything back to the drawing board. In the version of this night that actually happened, none of those things occurred. Poe dressed in black. He drove to Dolton. He found the right building, the right parking lot, the right angle of approach, and then he waited, positioned behind the shrubbery near the entrance in the dark for a car he already knew was coming. This was not an ambush born purely of opportunity. Too many elements suggest preparation: the clothes, the position, the getaway vehicle idling nearby. Petrie pulled the car in. She and Daniels were in the front. The kids were in the back. Poe came out from behind the bushes. The first shots came toward the windshield. Close enough that Petrie understood in an instant, with the clarity that extreme situations sometimes produce, exactly what was happening and exactly who was making it happen. Because she knew Paris Poe, she knew the shape of him, she knew the way he moved, even with a black mask covering his face, even in the dark of a parking lot in a suburb she had only been living in for 2 months. He got out of the car. He opened the door and put himself between the gunfire and the back seat, away from Petrie, away from the children, toward the man with the weapon. The 2 children were still in the car. The shooting was now concentrated somewhere else. Poe walked around the car door to where Daniels had fallen. He stood directly over him. He did not stop firing until there was nothing left to do. When it was finished, Poe walked back across the parking lot, got into the waiting gold Trailblazer, and left, not running, walking, the particular unhurried pace of someone who has completed the thing they came to do. Shanice Petrie would later tell investigators that the children were still in the back seat throughout. She called 911. On the 911 call, after giving the dispatcher what she needed, a location, a description, Petrie gave a name. Poleroski, 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 3 times, the same name each time. She had identified him through the mask, through the shock, through the dark, his eyes, his gait, the specific way Paris Poe occupied space in the world. She knew exactly who it was. Police arrived to find Keith Daniels dead in the parking lot of the apartment building the federal government had moved his family to for his safety. 10 days after his grand jury testimony, 4 days after the man he testified against had been arrested, and in the back seat of Shanice Petrie's car, a girl 4 years old, a boy 6. There is no public record of where they are now, no follow-up report in the file, no documented outcome attached to their names. They were present for every shot. They were present for the silence that followed, and then the official record moves on without them. A man walked out of a federal grand jury room 10 days before this night, having done the most dangerous thing he had likely ever done in his life, and when the moment came, he stepped out of a car in a parking lot in Dolton and moved toward the gun so that the children in the back seat would not have to. The file records his death. What it opened, that is a different matter. September 2016, Federal Courthouse, Chicago. 15 weeks of trial, one of the largest gang prosecutions the city had seen in years. 6 defendants at the defense table, and a judge who had, before a single witness took the stand, already ordered an anonymous jury. The Hobos were in handcuffs. 2 witnesses, called by the prosecution, could not quite bring themselves to remember. Bobby Simmons, a former NBA player who had been robbed at gunpoint, who had watched, according to the government, as shots were fired at his retreating car, took the stand and testified that he did not recall the incident clearly. A man named Mac Mason refused to testify at all. The judge held him in contempt and sentenced him to 60 days in jail. 60 days in jail rather than say one word about Paris Poe in a federal courtroom. That is what the Hobos had built. That fear did not disappear when they were arrested. It followed them into the room. But the prosecution had a witness that nobody could intimidate, nobody could threaten, nobody could reach. A federal agent stood up and read aloud the grand jury testimony of Keith Daniels, word for word, the testimony Daniels had given before he was killed, the testimony that described in his own language the interior world of an organization that his older brother had brought him into, and within that testimony, the moment. Paris Poe sat at the defense table and listened. Beside him, Arnold Council, not across the room, at the same table, the man who had personally recruited his younger brother into an organization whose defining feature was the permanent elimination of people who did what his younger brother did. Now sitting in real time while his younger brother's voice was returned from the dead by a federal transcript read aloud in a room Keith Daniels would never enter alive. No court record describes what Council's face looked like, whether he moved, whether anything passed between the two men at the table while the agent read. What the record shows is the simple geometry of it. They were close enough to touch in handcuffs while Keith Daniels spoke. Counsel had already said what he needed to say. On a recorded conversation obtained by investigators, he had addressed the killing of his own brother directly, hobo or nothing. It was not shouted over an enemy. It was spoken over blood. On January the 4th, 2017, after 15 weeks, all 6 defendants were found guilty on all primary counts. The dead man's testimony held August the 11th, 2017, United States District Court, Chicago. Judge John J. Tharp Jr. looked at Paris Poe and asked if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Poe stood up. He said 4 words. "I will not, sir." Not "I cannot," not "I have nothing to say." I will not. A choice stated plainly in the same federal building where a dead man's voice had been read back from a transcript 8 months earlier. Judge Tharp sentenced him to 3 concurrent life sentences. Before announcing the number, he said what he had concluded about the man standing before him, that Paris Poe was undeterrable, that his history showed a consistency of lawlessness and recklessness that gave the court no evidence time would change anything fundamental about him. He reduced it to 5 words: life is life. Poe's defense attorney argued that his client had known a difficult childhood, that by the time Poe reached 80, he would no longer be a danger to anyone. The record offered hardship. It did not offer interruption. Whatever Poe had survived, he had turned survival into a doctrine that other people had to die under. Poe did not appear to be a man divided against himself. That was the frightening part. The record shows no rupture between what he believed, what he did, and what he refused to say. I keep returning to the first moment in this story, the laugh, the moment Paris Poe heard that an informant had been killed and found it not sobering, not threatening, but amusing. And I keep placing it next to this moment. 4 words, a sit down, a face that gave nothing away. Between those 2 moments is an entire life lived according to a single operating principle. No exceptions written in, no clause for blood, no clause for children in a back seat playing with toys. He chose, consistently, deliberately, all the way to the last moment the law gave him a choice. What the law gave him back was nothing. 3 lifetimes in federal custody, the arithmetic of a system that had exhausted every other option. Judge Tharp noted for the record that Paris Poe had 7 children and no meaningful relationship with any of them. 7 children, no relationships, 3 life sentences. There is no version of that accounting that does not say something about what a life built on one law and nothing else eventually costs. But costs are not always paid by the person who made the calculation. In the parking lot of an apartment building in Dolton, Illinois, On the night of April the 14th, 2013, there was a car, and in the back seat of that car, two children, a girl, 4 years old, a boy, 6. They were playing with toys when the shooting started. They were still in the car when it stopped. They are somewhere. They would be young adults now. They are living the way all of us live, inside whatever the night of April the 14th, 2013 permanently made them. Paris Poe is in a federal prison. In the government's telling, the logic was simple: hobo or nothing. And two children who never made the choice are carrying the weight of it anyway. That is the part of this story the courthouse cannot close.